Thank you everyone for being here. I really appreciate the opportunity. I'm a big fan of Limud, the style, the setting, and everything else. So we'll dive right in and get started. Get my slideshow going, and off we go. So here you have my contact information if you do want to reach out separately, or if you're tweet inclined, that's my Twitter handle as well. So our program today is called Not From Heaven: What If Just People Wrote the Torah? And there's sort of a chicken and egg problem with this kind of a topic, because if you believe the Torah was written by God, then you'll find proof of that when you read the Torah. If you believe it was written by people, then you can find proof for that too. Now, as I warned you, I believe the Torah is not from heaven, not from the mouth of God, not by the hand of Moses. I accept and even celebrate that this approach is a substantial break from many Jewish traditions on the subject of who wrote the Torah. It's very clear from many traditional sources that a founding belief in rabbinic Judaism was divine Torah authorship. So just a few examples of this. In the Mishnah, in Sanhedrin 10, you have this famous passage that these are the parts of Israel that have no share in the world to come. Those who say resurrection of the dead is not in the Torah, and those who say ein Torah min hashamayim, that there is no Torah from heaven, or the Torah itself is not from heaven, and the Epicurus, or the heretic. And so maintaining the Torah is not from heaven would be a problem. And there's even stories that go into more detail. For example, in Menachot 29b in the Babylonian Talmud, you have this narrative. This leads into the story of Moses in Rabbi Akiva's classroom, where Akiva is teaching things that Moses doesn't even know are there from the Torah. But in the beginning of this story, you see Moses ascending to receive the Torah, and he sees God tying crowns, drawing the crowns on the Torah's letters. So there's a very almost mechanistic, God is writing the scroll that Moses is receiving. And a few hundred years later, you have Maimonides' Ani Ma'amin, his 13 Principles of Faith, that again clearly articulate a divine authorship. That the Torah that is in our hands, it is the same one that was given to Moses, our teacher. So there's a clear sense of divine authorship and perfection, which is also reflected in the blessings that are recited over the reading of the Torah scroll in most synagogues. In fact, the texts that I'm sharing appear both on Chabad.org and on ReformedJudaism.org, albeit with different transliterations into English, but the same Hebrew texts. This is part of the Torah blessing ritual, where you praise God who has chosen us from all the peoples, V'natan lanu et Torato, and given us his Torah. And blessed are you, God, who gives the Torah. And then later on in the service, you have this famous line, Zot HaTorah, this is the Torah that Moses placed before the children of Israel, Al Pi Adonai, by the mouth of God, in the hand Bayad Moshe. So again, a very clear statement of divine authorship, and that this Torah is the same one that Moses got from God to the children of Israel. Now, the dilemma with this is that there are a lot of challenges to that claim of simple divine authorship, from archaeology, from approaches to the text in a historical sense, simply from the evidence to be found in the ground. After all, we don't think, most Jews in the world today don't think that Adam and Eve is a factual story of human origins, or that there was a global flood, which is not reflected in the global geology. So once you accept that the beginning of the Torah is not exactly factual history, you have to decide, where do these Jewish origin myths end and where does Jewish history begin? So a number of responses to this have been developed, including the idea of partial revelation. Maybe parts of the Torah were divinely revealed and other parts were written by people. Also the concept of progressive revelation, that each generation received the insight into the universe from the divine in ways that they could understand, and sometimes with limitations from what we might understand today. I've even seen some sources that talk about the R of the redactor, with the idea that there are many sources of the Bible and an editor's layer or redactor layer on top. You have similar discussions in the Talmud, by the way, as well. But the idea is that the R for the redactor source, you could just read as Rabbeinu, whether it was Moses or someone else who put the text in its final form. In fact, sometimes you'll hear in certain seminaries a discussion of the text as received. I just want to look at it the way it is now, not how it came to be or where, but the way it was understood and studied over the centuries in Jewish life. You can see other examples of trying to grapple with these challenging questions on a relatively new website called thetorah.com, which brings in observant individuals in the Jewish tradition who are nevertheless taking seriously these questions of authorship, time and place, and so on. So I want to present to you one example of this articulation that was taken from an article by Rabbi David Wolpe. About 20 years ago, Rabbi Wolpe got in a bit of trouble with his congregation because he said at a Passover-related event that the Exodus didn't really happen the way it's described in the Haggadah. And people were shocked. My favorite quote in the LA Times story about it was one member said, "Did he have to say it around Passover time? You know, maybe say it in your library, but don't say it in front of everybody in a service." But Wolpe, a few years later, wrote this article on BeliefNet entitled, "Did the Exodus Really Happen?" And he articulates this perspective of what I call people plus, that it's not just people from this perspective, and it's not just divine authorship, a la crowns on the letters, but it's people plus divine revelation. Now, he points out that some people are simply afraid of saying out loud what they know to be true. One scholar who actually criticized him in print told him over lunch, "Well, what you say is true, but we should not say it publicly." In other words, it's sort of like Jack Nicholson in A Few Good Men, "You can't handle the truth." He felt that people could handle the truth. And what he says in the second paragraph I've selected, "The fact that God's hand is in the Bible is a pillar of belief for many, myself included. That human hands are in there as well does not detract from its sanctity, but reminds us that God and human beings are partners in this world in ways we did not, when we first learned our Bible lessons, even imagine." So the idea of a partnership theology here applies not only to doing good in the world and tikkun olam and so on, but also to the very authorship of the revelatory text, be it Torah or Bible more broadly. And he points out at the bottom that the Torah for him is not a book we turn to for historical accuracy, but rather for truth. And I've used that quote sometimes in presentations on this topic, and I find that some people hear that quote and say, "Yeah, that fits exactly my perspective." And other people hear the Torah is not historical accuracy, but truth, and they say, "What does that mean? If it's truth, how could it not be historically accurate?" So there's just different ways of thinking about the text, some more concrete and some more abstract, or thinking in different categories of truth. Nevertheless, this is also not my approach. My approach, as I said, is it's just people. I am the one that Mishnah Sanhedrin warns you about. I believe the Torah was written by people and only people, not written directly by God and not by people plus. Now, my goal today is not to convince you that I am correct, but I do hope at the end of our 50 minutes or so that you will understand why people who feel this way believe this is a reasonable conclusion, and what this belief that it's just people means for our connections with and appreciation of Torah. Some of this information will resonate with you. Some may find it foreign or even threatening. And all I say is welcome to Jewish pluralism. It's all of the above. So first, a few examples of why it's reasonable to believe the Torah was written by people. First, a textual perspective. Often ancestral cultural wisdom has an oral stage of transmission and then it's ultimately written down, but it's very rarely composed by just one person. In fact, that's why I said just people, not person, because it may have been many people and many sources over the centuries that developed these stories and narratives and ultimately written texts. And if you're taking the approach that it's written by people over time, then you can ask different questions about Torah passages. You can say, who wrote this? And when did they write this? And why did they write this? What was their agenda in putting this text together? So as just one example of this, and there are many sources you can turn to see an academic approach to the question of who wrote the Torah and when. There's a very nice book, very popular still, called Who Wrote the Bible by Richard Elliott Friedman that gives you a good introduction to the subject. And this is one passage that he highlights as a good example of this phenomenon. So you'll notice at the very beginning of this selection from the story of Noah in Genesis 6 and 7, that you have the B'nai Elohim, the sons of God, or sons of the gods maybe, because Elohim could be understood as a plural form, who are having children with the daughters of men and taking them as wives. And those children become the mighty men of old. This sounds very much like Greek mythology, demigods, Hercules, heroes, and so on. Very much not like the later concept of an absolute monotheism and a separation between heaven and earth that we're used to. And so then this Elohim, God, says to Noah that he's going to wipe out all flesh, and Noah will get a covenant. And of every living thing, take 2 of every kind onto the ark to save them with you. Thus did Noah, it says, according to all that Elohim, God, commanded him. And then at the very beginning of the next chapter, and Yahweh said to Noah, that YHWH is that 4-letter name for God that you're not supposed to say. What happens here is it seems to change. First of all, the divine name changes. But then notice the flavor of the command, which was already given and accomplished. Come you and all your house into the ark. I have seen righteous before me in my generation you are. Of every clean beast you will take 7 pairs, the male and female, and beasts that are not clean 1 pair, the male and his female. Already you see a couple of differences here. The name of God is one. There's a reason given why Noah is saved, because he's righteous, and there's wonderful commentary on what it means to be righteous in a generation. Of every clean beast, what is this clean beasts and unclean beasts? That's a whole new concept. And then why do you need extra pairs of the clean beasts? Well, the simple answer is if you're going to either eat them or sacrifice them, you need extras. Because if you only had 1 cow and 1 bull and you want a steak after you get off the ark, oh well. So this reflects a different ideology and a different approach to dividing animals and even the story itself because of the emphasis on the number 7. This is often connected with the creation stories, where in Genesis 1, you have a 7-day creation story often attributed to the priestly documents or priestly sources, whereas other stories in Genesis 2 and 3, which have human beings and plants and animals created in a different order, may come from a different source as well. So this is just one example. I don't want to get lost in the weeds of this particular story, but just to show you this is the approach people take when they're looking at who wrote this and when and why. Now, another example that will make this challenging is that we can understand the Torah story as coming from a political perspective and not always a accurate reflection of its time period. So later in the Noah story, we're not going to look at the text specifically. Noah has 3 sons, you'll remember, Ham, Shem, and Yafet. Ham is the wicked son who is described as the father of Canaan, and he's the one who sees his father naked. And again, it repeats the father of Canaan, the father of Canaan. Later on in the genealogy, you have the descendants of Yafet, the descendants of Shem, the Shemites. Ultimately, Eber is one of those, becoming the line of the Hebrews. And then you have the descendants of Ham, which include Cush, which is Ethiopia, Mitzrayim, you remember, is Egypt, Put, which is Libya, and Canaan. So all of the enemies of the Hebrews are understood to be descended from Ham. The problem, again, archaeologically, anthropologically, is that we found the Canaanites. And they are, in fact, a Semitic people with a Semitic language and material culture, and even a pantheon of gods that includes names like Yud He Vav He and El as part of their divine pantheon. More likely, the Hebrew people were an evolution out of Canaanite culture than a radical break from it from the time of the flood. So this genealogy of Ham is much more politics of a later generation than it is a reflection of an accurate anthropology of the different peoples of the region. And this comes out of our historical perspective. When we dig in the ground, when we look at this from a concept of human-created culture, we understand that human-created culture evolves, changes over time. It develops in response to surrounding cultures. And the beliefs and practices that appear at the end of that process can be very different from what came before. So as one example, this is a relic that was discovered in Untitled Chapter, which is a site in the eastern Sinai, sort of to the west of the Negev now. And you would think at first glance, this has almost nothing to do with Hebrew Jewish culture, because you've got these weird godlike figures with clear genitalia, gender markings. But when you actually decipher the inscription, which is in a kind of Paleo-Hebrew script, it includes the line, Yahweh and his Asherah. We know Asherah is a fertility goddess, a feminine goddess, and often condemned in biblical literature as one of the deviations of the Hebrews. In this particular case, you see this depiction, you see a description of Yahweh with a wife, and you might come up with a headline like this one that appeared in Haaretz in 2018. A strange drawing in Sinai could undermine our entire idea of Judaism. Is that a picture of God and his genitalia and his wife as depicted by early Jews, by the Hebrews? Well, this is part of our challenge in understanding the evolution of Jewish thought. And so it may be the case that certain texts, even in the Torah, reflect this theological evolution more than a completely formed monotheism, again, if it's written by people. So here's one example of an episode in that history where it describes a reform undertaken under King Josiah around 622 BCE. And we actually have archaeological confirmation for this reform because they found a trove of idols that had been intentionally broken and dated to around the same time period. So it seems like there was some kind of religious change. Here it describes where the king had rebuilt the temple and found a book there, and he reads the words of this book of the covenant that had been found. He makes a covenant before Yahweh to keep his commandments and his testimonies, his statutes, with all his heart and all his soul, to confirm the words of this covenant. That rhetoric should sound somewhat familiar, with all his heart and all his soul, very much like the hortatory oratory of the book of Deuteronomy. So this may reflect, in fact, part of that evolution, because scholars believe it was likely the book of Deuteronomy that Josiah found in this period. You can see the kind of reforms he undertook are popular reforms described in the book of Deuteronomy as well. And there's also an interesting line at the very end of this. He commands all the people, keep the Passover to Yahweh your God as written in the book of this covenant. Surely there was not held such a Passover from the days of the judges that judged Israel, nor in all the days of the kings of Israel, nor of the kings of Judah, but in the 18th year wherein this Passover was held in Jerusalem. Now, which is more likely? That there had been the Torah given at Sinai in its complete written form and studied according to the tradition by King David and by all the leaders of the people, and yet they had never done the Passover correctly in all that time? Or as an alternative, maybe this approach to the spring festival of Pesach and Matzot was something new. And in fact, it was a break with the past, just like those idols had been broken, and the beginning of something new that is claimed to be very old. And that may be a more plausible historical reconstruction of what happens during this reform. And you have a similar episode in the book of Nehemiah after the return from exile, where they find written in the law, when they read the entire Sefer Torah Moshe, the book of the law of Moses, that there is this holiday in the fall called Sukkot, in the feast of the 7th month. And again it says, when they made these Sukkot and lived in them, since the days of Joshua the son of Nun to that day, the children of Israel had not done this. And there was great gladness, and every day he read in the book of the law of God. Scholars generally think that this may have been when the Torah was actually finally compiled, more or less in the version that we have now, with small scribal changes over the centuries. It's a whole secondary field called secondary criticism, aside from the primary criticism of where did the sources come from. And so this is just one more example of a place where you could say, oh, this is another stage in the evolution. And you can also ask the question, what kind of Judaism were they running in that first temple period with no Sukkot and with no Passover the way we understand it for most of that period? Again, if it's written by people over time, that makes more sense. Now, there are other ways to understand this as a human-authored book, and that might be a moral perspective. If this is a book written by people, then some of its wisdom is going to be timeless, a wonderful, insightful depiction of the human condition and how to respond to it. And sometimes the content will be a product of its particular time and place. So a few examples. The majority of Jews in the world, and certainly in America, would find the juxtaposition of these three ideas as very problematic. The idea that child sacrifice is in the same category and list as male homosexual behavior and bestiality. Now, you hear this sometimes in the heated rhetoric around same-sex rights and respect today, but this is also part of our ancestral tradition. If you think this is a timeless truth, that's going to be a challenge. If, on the other hand, you think this was written by people 2,500 years ago from their particular perspective with their insights and their biases, then it's somewhat easier to grapple with this as part of your ideological family tree. It's an earlier generation's view of this issue, and most of us today would respond differently. Another example is the conquest of the land as prescribed in Deuteronomy, where it describes basically a genocide or an ethnic cleansing of wiping out the peoples who were already there, grant them no turfs, gives them no quarter, and indeed a kind of religious Jewish jihad to tear down their altars, smash their pillars, cut their asherim, their sacred posts again, the Asherah, and burn their idols. So this is to prevent them from tempting you, but it is certainly not our model of interreligious dialogue. And if you want to go to the world of Facebook memes and imagery, this example says that God, in writing the Bible, could have banned slavery or shellfish, and he chose shellfish. Again, a reflection of a different set of values. Now, you could also add a broader perspective of simply a philosophy. Consider this. If this is accurate, and we are simply a dot in this gigantic cosmos, does it make sense that the God of all of the entire universe would choose one small people in one small corner of this planet to reveal the ultimate truths of the universe, including the plans by which the entire world was made in Hebrew? It seems implausible. And the other side of philosophy is ethics. We have this wonderful line in Leviticus to love your neighbor as yourself, or do unto others is another framing of this golden rule. There's Hillel's version that's negative, but there's also versions in Confucianism, in Islam, and in a lot of other traditions, many of whom never had any interaction with Hebrew culture that we could claim the origin for this. And there's something, I don't know, problematic about claiming we invented this concept of treating people like people. I don't think that's the case. I think it's rather an insight gleaned from the human experience. And so other humans in a similar experience have come up with similar conclusions. This particular painting by Norman Rockwell reflects that diversity of tolerance. So again, this is trying to present that this is a rational approach to the text, and there are some reasons behind these conclusions. But once you've come to that conclusion, if you do, that it was written by just people, then there are some implications and some consequences to that. If the text of the Torah or a particular passage was written in a particular time and place by people with an agenda, then now some of these challenging passages are no longer the dilemma to explain away. You know, you have this passage about Hebrew slavery, and I've seen people try to apologize for this, or at least make atonement for it by saying, well, it's better than American chattel slavery, and it's better than other slaveries in the time and place that it was there. Again, if this is a timeless document, then I would think it would have a timeless truth. And notice that some of the statements here are actually somewhat cruel. If the master gives the slave a wife and she's born children, the wife and children belong to the master, and he leaves alone unless he agrees to be a slave for life. And when a man strikes his slave and the slave dies, he gets avenged if he dies right away. But if the slave survives a day or two, there's no vengeance because he belongs to the owner. Again, some problematic perspectives from our sense of values. But you can also see that the idea of Torah values and our values may be like a Venn diagram, where not all of our values are going to come out of the Torah, and not all of the values expressed by the Torah may agree with us. So there are some areas where there are our Torah values overlapping the two, but they may not be automatically one identified with the other. Another conclusion is that if these texts were written in a particular time and place by people, then you can make a distinction between the Torah and Torah commentary. This is the classic version of what were called the Mikraot Gedolot, the expanded scriptures, where you would have the written text and you would have the commentary by authorized commentators, and it would be the lens through which you read the original sources, not on their own, just as a pshat, but through the lenses of rabbinic interpretation and commentary. But the reality is, again, if the Torah is written by people, then Rashi is also a person who writes in his time and his place with some insights, but also with the limitations of his own knowledge and setting. After all, a commentary on Shakespeare is not Shakespeare. Milton's Paradise Lost is marvelous English poetry based on the book of Genesis, but it is not the Torah. It is Milton's response to the Torah. You can have multiple and profound meanings that emerge from the creative interaction between the reader and the text. This is a hallmark of postmodern reading theory. But the original text alone, or its author or authors, do not get all the credit for that insight. So I would rather say, here's what I created from reading the Torah, than a simple, this is what the Torah teaches. Some will call a new teaching Torah, and I understand that concept. Others will say that it's something different. You know, you can say it's poetry because it's based on earlier poetry. It's Torah teaching because it's based on earlier teaching. But I sometimes think it's worth making a distinction between the Torah and, quote, Torah as later generations of interpretation. Another implication is that if this is a human author document, then the 70 faces of Torah text are our faces and the different ways we read it. Time and place matter, but literature is not simply raw material for historical analysis. We can also read it in a lot of different ways. You can have feminist readings, you can have queer readings, you can have secular readings, psychological readings. You can read it as literature or as law or as philosophy or as a cultural artifact. And those don't have to conflict with each other. They're different lenses to read the text. So here's one example where you can read this passage in Exodus with God as a literary character. Moses is up on the mountain and God has decided to destroy the people because of the sin of the golden calf. And it sounds almost like two parents when their kids have done something wrong. Yahweh speaks to Moses, hurry down for your people whom you brought out of the land of Egypt. It's like, you know, your kid has done this. And he complains about all the things they've done wrong. And Yahweh further says to Moses, this is a stiff-necked people. Now leave me alone. Let me go to wipe them out. And again, there's fascinating commentary on this that describes Moses deciding to intervene and what's involved in speaking back to God in the way that he does. There's a wonderful ethic there called Zit Talui Bi, it hangs on me, literally, to intervene in this case. And also the fact that God says, let me be, is almost like, you know, hold me back. And he wants Moses to hold him back. This is almost permission to let him do so. And then notice how Moses intervenes, but he does so very psychologically astute, the way you would address someone that has a bit of an anger management issue. So he says to God, saying, do not let your anger blaze forth against your people, whom you deliver. Notice the correction there, re-emphasizing the connection between God and the people, with great power and a mighty hand. And then he also uses the power of social perception. Let not the Egyptians say, it is with evil intent he delivered them to kill them off in the mountains and to annihilate them from the face of the earth. Turn from your blazing anger, renounce the plan to punish your people again, reminding him. So what would the Egyptians say if they heard you destroyed them? And then he adds another layer of guilt. Remember your servants, even if you don't like this generation. Remember the ones you did like and whom you promised and whom you loved. How you swore to them by yourself. You're going to take your own name in vain? You promised them by your own name that you would do this and to make their offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven and give them the land. And it works. The anger management therapy works, and God renounces the punishment he planned to bring upon his people. Now, that kind of a reading is a more psychological, comparing to human family dynamics reading. You wouldn't generally find that in a traditional religious setting, but that's another way we can bring our face to the Torah and understand it differently if we think of it as written by people. If the Torah was written by just people, then it's a product of the genius and the mishigas of the Jewish people. We are not just custodians for this document. We are, in fact, its creators. There was an early American Reform rabbi named Emil Hirsch, who was based in Chicago. I'm in the Chicago metro area, but he was a giant of the movement at the turn of the 20th century. And he was a big fan of archaeology and of this new critical approach to the sources. He said, the Bible is literature, the literature of a highly gifted people. The modern critical school has restored the Bible to us. If the Bible came down from the clouds, as no other book has, it is not our own. We're the museum curators. Whereas if we wrote it, then we get to claim the good parts, and I would say also we get to claim the parts that we might disagree with. And finally, there are all kinds of implications that might transform our approach to Judaism. As just one example, remember Wolpe in his articles said that this approach is very different from how we first learned our Bible lessons. Well, I might ask him, so when do you teach it to your Sunday school classes? At what age should they learn this approach that it was written, whether it's people plus or just people, and all of these details about archaeology and documents and so on? How much detail should you offer? Or maybe you should just start with the approach that's written by people, and then at a later point, add the idea that some people believe this was all written by a God. How much detail do you offer into these sources and evidences? And can you compare it with other mythologies? After all, there are creation stories and origin stories in other cultures too. And if you do that, how do you maintain a distinctively Jewish approach to these sources and documents? A second implication will be, what do you do in the ritual context? Do you treat the Torah scroll the same way if you don't necessarily believe it's al pi Hashem, from the mouth of God and by the hand of Moses? Maybe you might put the Torah in the library with other books by people. Now, I would encourage not putting it in the card catalog and letting people check it out. Don't list it as an option, but having it in a library might work. Or maybe you flip it. And maybe you say, this is a book by people and very, very important. And we have other books by people that we also find important. Maybe we add books to our ark and make our ark a little bit wider. Maybe we even make Shavuot a bit wider as a celebration of Jewish writing and Jewish ideas and Jewish literature, including but also going beyond just the Torah. What do we do with our liturgy? Do we still want to say this is the Torah in the traditional phrasing? And my understanding is many Reconstructionist congregations don't do that because of this particular issue. Now, I will agree that it would be very hard to get people to start saying, this is the Torah that Ezra the priest compiled from multiple sources, developing over centuries and finalized around 500 BC. It's not going to have the same resonance as the traditional phrasing. I understand that. But it does raise an interesting question of, what does our liturgy mean if we're saying it? Are we just repeating the old words, or are we saying what we truly believe? And then finally, this is that chicken and egg concept I started with. This might not work for certain theologies, but it might work very well for other approaches to Jewish life. There are plenty of Jews out there who might describe themselves as deists, who believe in a God that started the world but doesn't intervene anymore in an active way, certainly doesn't write a Torah that cares what you eat or whom you love. There are plenty of Jews who might call themselves agnostics or believe in Spinoza's style of a God of the universe. And in the Pew study of Jewish Americans from 2013, when they asked people, are you certain there's a God? Do you believe probably there's a God, or do you not believe in a God or universal spirit? 20% of American Jews answered they do not believe in a God or universal spirit. And so approaching the Torah as written by people might be meaningful to them. Now, even if only people wrote the Torah, it's still the foundational literature of Jewish culture. And you would be illiterate in the later generations of Jewish culture if you did not study and understand and approach the Torah in a meaningful way. And yet, it is not necessarily us as the custodians. I prefer to think of us as the authors. And so that's why I say with great gratitude, Baruch atah Yisrael noten haTorah. Blessed are you, Israel, the giver of the Torah. So I see we have a number of questions in our chat box. I wonder, Avram, if you've had a chance to look through them, if there were any questions that came up multiple times or topics that seem particularly interesting to highlight.
Yes, going through them, it looks like we got kind of nice. That was awesome. We have a lot of comments. Not so many specific questions. So I think this is a good opportunity that if people do have follow-up questions, throw them into the chat, and we can go through them.
Someone asked about expanding a bit further on the Canaanite discrepancy. I'm not sure about the discrepancy, what's meant by that, but in terms of the relationship between Canaanites and the Hebrews, languages evolve in families. You've got the Indo-European languages, you've got Latin-based languages, the Romance languages, and there are Semitic languages. Arabic and Aramaic and Hebrew are a few examples of those. Canaanite was one of those languages. And generally, there's a sense when it comes to languages that they evolve in a biological sense from the people who speak them. There's a reason why in Yiddish we call it Mama Loshen, mother tongue, because it's what your mama speaks to you. You learn it in that way. And so the fact that the material culture is similar, that the ideology has some interesting parallels, and the languages are similar suggests some kind of common ancestry. I mean, I can give you another example of the stories mixing. The story of the ancestry of the Moabites and the Ammonites. They're described as the bastard children of incest from Lot and his daughters after Sodom and Gomorrah. My guess is the Moabites and Canaanites didn't use that story as their own origin story, that's an origin story told by the Hebrews about the Moabites and the Ammonites to say they're all bastards and they've always been bastards. And so it's a reflection, again, of a later generation writing the story with their ideology as opposed to an accurate reflection of the anthropology. But that's reasonable. I mean, we shouldn't expect 21st century anthropology from 9th century BCE authorship and cultural wisdom. The irony is sometimes when it comes to archaeology, we know more about the immediate past of people who lived centuries ago than the people who lived just a few centuries later, because they didn't know what was under that tell, that mountain on which they were living. I've seen a number of other comments coming through here. Someone says, comment on how those who believe the Torah was written by God, how they explain the Torah continues past Moses' death and writes about itself. There are a lot of other holes people have poked in these sources, pointing out human authorship or finding evidence for that. That's not my department to try to find a way to make it harmonize. There are plenty of other authors that have tried to do that, and some who have admitted it. There's a medieval author named Abraham ibn Ezra who does a commentary on the Torah, and he talks about that part at the end of Deuteronomy where it describes what happens afterward, and that Moses was the greatest prophet that ever lived. And he sort of highlights the problem there, and then just says, Misha Yavin Yavin, whoever understands will understand, and doesn't play it out explicitly because he's writing in the 1200s. He's not going to be as explicit with his kfirah, his heresy on that topic. So this is one example of someone who had a hint of a problem there, but didn't necessarily feel comfortable saying it all the way. And there are other examples like that that pop up episodically in Jewish history. You can find, in the atheist and secular worlds, lists of mistakes of the Bible and discontinuities and so on. I'm less interested in doing that than finding ways to approach the text creatively. And that's why I say it's not only a question of accurate or not, or finding holes or not, but also finding ways of positive connection where I can appreciate where my people explored the human condition from their own vantage point and time period, and then compare that to my own. A lot of comments have blown through here. I don't know if there's others worth highlighting. Avram, did you notice any particularly interesting?
Yeah, I sent you a couple in a private chat. So here's one. The basis of Shabbat is the seventh day of creation. Given the universe is 14 billion years old, how do you view Shabbat?
Okay. So again, I would see Shabbat as I see the Torah as a creation of the Jewish people. We don't really know of any other culture that developed an every 7-day holiday. Now, if you were a priest designing a calendar, that might be good for you because you get people to show up at least once a week. You have a holiday every week as opposed to seasonally. But it most likely is a Jewish original. There were other days of stopping in Babylonian culture. They had something called Shabbatum, which was a day of awe and terror where you would hide, but it was once a month. It wasn't every week. And the idea of 7 days cycling independent of the seasons is also unusual in human culture. So I would see it as a creation of the Jewish people. And again, some see it as a memory of a literal creation of the world and see the Jewish year not just as a cultural artifact, but as a literal depiction of the age of the earth. And others see it as part of our cultural inheritance that we get to choose from and adapt as we want. You'll notice on the wall behind me, I have some artwork. Imagine you inherit a great aunt's attic with all these pieces of art, and some of them work beautifully in your home, and some of them are old and dusty and you don't necessarily want them. And some of them could work for you, but they need a new frame or another setting to work in your home. They're all yours, what you've inherited. But your house is still your house, and you still get to make choices of how you use that inheritance and then add your own creativity to what you present as the artwork of your living life. So I might choose some elements of this. I might choose elements to adapt. So Shabbat might be a day to celebrate Jewish identity, or a day of stopping and resting, a day of no phones, a day of no Zoom. Wouldn't that be an exciting opportunity? There's all kinds of possibilities to be creative in responding to Shabbat that don't have to only fit into the original category in the priestly literature and in the Torah of remarking 7 days of creation.
Great.
Other examples?
We have an interesting question about halakha. So halakha is predicated on the divine origin of the Torah. Please comment on this. Thanks.
Sure. Well, I mean, as you might guess from the chutzpah you've already seen presented, if I think that the written Torah is by people, then I would also believe that the oral Torah is by people as well, and that the Talmud is by people. And again, that it's a human process of trying to understand the world and their inheritance. Now, there are some people who follow halakha as a cultural ritual. You know, they're connecting with their ancestors by doing what their ancestors did. Some choose from that, and they might keep kosher at home but not out, or might keep kashrut but not observe Shabbat all the way. And people make their own choices. You know, the denominations are like waypoints on a spectrum. It's not like there's hard lines anymore in between them. And so, again, accepting that there is a halakha out there, that's fine. In fact, I find it very useful to look at sources like the Shulchan Aruch and Talmud and Mishnah Torah as artifacts of Jewish history to know what Jews in that period thought Jews should be doing. That's really useful to understand the evolution of Jewish culture. But it doesn't necessarily mean that I have to follow all those things to feel connected to my ancestors. My grandparents did things very differently than the way I do them in all kinds of areas. You know, maybe my kugel has low-fat sour cream instead of full-fat sour cream. Am I disrespecting my ancestors because I've chosen a slightly different recipe? I don't think so. Maybe I don't want kugel every Shabbat. Maybe I don't like raisins in food, and so I've taken those out. Well, this is my inheritance that I get to choose from, and halakha is one more example of this, where it's part of the historical practice of the Jews, and I'm free as my own person responding to what other people have done to make my choices.
Thanks, Rabbi. Great. So we have some more questions that came in. How about, is there anything in Judaism that's essential, or is it all expendable depending on the whims of history?
Very interesting question. I think that each Jew to some extent and each group of Jews will make different choices in that regard. There are some who have decided that a strict adherence to halakha is essential, and anything other than that is not Judaism and will lead to disappearance of Jews. And so they write off everybody to the left of them. There are others that think that you need some kind of halakhic process, but it has to be flexible and responsive to contemporary issues. And they might not accept those who don't follow any kind of halakha. And there are other Jews who see their inheritance as a library to choose from. And they're each going to make different choices. I'll bet you no two people on this screen have exactly the same Jewish library on their shelves. They've all made different choices for what books they want. And so deciding what's essential, you could sort of survey them and see, well, they all have a Hebrew Bible. They all have a copy of, maybe a Hebrew dictionary if they're Hebrew literate. There may be some things, and there may be others who are not Hebrew literate that have a Yiddish dictionary or have other sources that they use. They may have books of Jewish history, and others may have only Talmud and Talmudic commentaries and no books of Jewish history. So I think that it's going to be different for different groups of Jews. I don't know that you can identify one belief or one practice that's going to be common among all Jews. You know, we used to say that what unites the Jews is God, Torah, and Israel. In my experience, nothing divides Jews as much as God, Torah, and Israel. What do you mean by God? What does God want of you? What do you mean by Torah? How authoritative is it? Who counts as Israel? And then what do we do about the modern state of Israel? Those are the three things that we argue about the most. So it's not that we have them, I guess we have it in common because we all argue about the same things. But I don't know that that is the same thing as what people are looking for, as sort of an essentialism that you have to have, that everyone has to believe. Whenever someone says to me, Judaism says, I always say, which Judaism and when and for whom? I don't know that there's one automatic answer that applies to every Jew. I hear someone writing, this is a topic my congregation deals with as well. What happens when a kid is assigned a bloody or difficult Torah portion, if you're committed to reciting the Torah portion of the week? One thing that we've done is we allow our students to choose a Torah reading rather than assign them one. So they can pick one that's meaningful to them, and we are not tied to the portion of the week in the 1-year cycle. Remember, there's also a 3-year cycle that some congregations follow alternatively. So you could try that alternative, or you could open up the box and say, this B mitzvah event, to be gender neutral, is a coming of age ceremony. And maybe there are other ways to do coming of age ceremonies in Jewish life that aren't only reading the assigned Torah portion for this week. So what my congregation does is I talk with the students about what they're interested in and what they like to read and do on their own. And we work together to try and choose a focus for their presentation. It could be the Torah portion of the week, which I show them. I also show them the Torah portion for their birth date, which may be different. I show them other interesting stories that they've highlighted as things they remember from their educational experience, or that may reflect some of the issues or values that they brought into their lives. And we also look at other Hebrew sources later in the Tanakh, in modern Hebrew poetry. Maybe they want to grapple with that instead. Or maybe they choose an idea or an issue or a person from out of the wide range of the Jewish experience and do a research project based on that. I've had students do projects on what does it mean to be Jewish and vegetarian. And so they look at some of the original sources, but also look at modern Jewish vegetarian organizations and talk about what would be different about a Passover Seder without a lamb shank, or creating Torah scrolls without animal skin parchment, and what are some of the variables involved in that. I had another student do the history of synagogue architecture because he liked architecture. So he actually designed his own synagogue and talked about what he put where and why and how he did it. And so that is in fact one of the creative responses. This is clearly a Jewish project. This is clearly connecting to his heritage and his identity. He happened to do a reading about the building of the Mishkan, which is again a creation of holy space or separate space for Jewish life. But that was chosen after he chose the topic because he wanted to find a subject that interested him. So I would say when it comes to be mitzvah, not to be tied to the Torah scroll again, as if you were commanded and forced to follow it. In Reconstructionism, famously, Kaplan said, tradition has a vote but not a veto. So outvote it on this topic and choose an alternative that might be more relevant to the student than leprosy or menstrual impurity or other problems like that. I do also see another interesting one. What if some of the Torah's authors were unjust people? I think they were people. When I say just people, I don't mean they were all interested in justice all the time. They were people. And so they had insight and they had limitations. And that's what makes, I find, reading the Torah an interesting dialogue. You know, in many ways, reading the Torah is a kind of postmodern reading where it's not just the text telling me what to think and to say. And it's not just me reading whatever I want out of the text and saying, well, even though it says an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, it must mean money. I'm going to read the text as it is, as best I can understand it, with all the context clues I can get, just like I want to know Shakespeare lived in Elizabethan England to understand what he's talking about. But I can also put other lenses on, and I can look at it from a feminist perspective, or a secular perspective, or a psychological perspective, or a poetic perspective. And that's a legitimate reading too. As I said, there are 70 faces to Torah, but I think think of a Zoom room. It's the 70 faces that are here. And maybe one has the right as speaker, but everyone else has the rights as thinker.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. So what is the role of prayer and the recipient of prayer in general in this context? What does it look like?
Great question. So for many people, prayer is not defined by the words on the page. It's more defined by the emotions expressed and evoked. So when they're asking for healing, for example, they don't really expect a divine, penicillin shot to come down and intervene in their health. What they're looking for instead is some kind of sympathy from the universe. If you read Harold Kushner's book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, it's kind of like a cheerleader, anesthetic kind of God who can help you through things, but doesn't necessarily intervene. But for other people, it's simply expressing the feelings that they feel. The desire for healing itself has validity. There's a wonderful line in a Yehuda Amichai poem where he describes, he has a piece of tombstone on his desk that says Amen on it. And at the end of the poem, he says very beautifully, gods in the sky come and go, gods appear and disappear, but prayers remain forever. That the human expression of longing and desire and hope and fear, that's the essence of the prayer experience, not that you're talking to something that's going to answer back. Now, the question becomes, do I fit that desire and emotional experience into the traditional words, which still say atah and melech and all those other concepts, you and king? Or do I maybe create new poetry that speaks to the light of inspiration I find within myself or within other people? Or I talk to the world as a whole, or I talk to the people of Israel. And that's why I did that version of Baruch Atah Yisrael Noten HaTorah. Maybe I reframe it to what I really mean in terms of expressing that desire. And maybe that's a more satisfying way to say what I mean and to feel that emotional expression in the key of the tradition, but in my own particular notation and vocabulary. So prayer can mean different things for different people, even in the same congregation. How much more so in the wide diversity of Jewish life represented by the Limud experience, that the experience of community gathering, whether one calls it prayer or celebration or something else, can be very, very diverse.
Great. Thank you, Rabbi. Unfortunately, we're at time, but thank you for sharing this Torah in larger context Torah with all of us today.
Right. And just as a reminder, if you want to find me, I was going to go back to the first 10. Anyways, my email is just dean, D-E-A-N, at iishj.org, or I tweet at hjrabbi. So you can message me that way as well.